The old woman collapsed right outside the pharmacy, and 20 people stepped around her as if stepping around a puddle of dirty water. It was a November night in Chicago, the cold cutting through thin coats as though they weren't even there. The 71-year-old woman knelt on the frozen sidewalk, one hand clutching a lamppost, the other pressed hard against her chest. The paper bag in her arms split open. A bottle of pills rolled into the gutter, its cap popping off, the white tablets drifting away on the murky stream. Her breath rasped in short, frantic bursts, as if an invisible hand were tightening around her throat. "Out of the way, old lady." A man with a leather briefcase snapped at her, slipping past without so much as a glance down. A woman quickly pulled her child to the other side of the street, muttering something about drunks on the corner. Not a single person stopped. Not a single person bent down. Half a block away, Delia Foster had just stepped out the back door of the diner. Her legs had been standing for 9 straight hours, and in her apron pocket sat a mere $11 in tips from one long night. She had exactly 20 minutes to catch the last bus to pick up her daughter. She was late. She was always late. Then she saw the old woman. Delia didn't stop to calculate anything. She didn't think about the bus, about the child waiting for her, about the cost of 20 minutes she didn't have. She simply dropped her own bag to the ground and bolted across the street. "Ma'am, look at me. Let me help you up." She slid an arm behind the stranger's back, fished a peppermint candy from her apron pocket, and placed it in the woman's trembling palm. "Hold this in your mouth. Breathe slow. I'm right here." The old woman looked up. Her red-rimmed, panicked eyes latched onto the young woman's face, the way a drowning person grabs a lifeline. Delia had no idea of the name of the woman she now held in her arms. She didn't know where she lived, nor did she understand why, on a street full of people, no one else would stop. And she could never have guessed that the woman gasping for breath in her arms was the mother of the most powerful, the coldest, and the most feared man in all of Chicago. A name even the police lowered their voices to speak. She didn't know that the 20 minutes she was about to trade away that night would rewrite the rest of her life, and her daughter's, completely. She only knew that someone needed help. And for Delia Foster, that had always been enough. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and share it with someone who needs their faith and kindness restored. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel, so that every week we can listen together to stories proving that good people still walk among us. The only taxi still parked across the street at almost 11 o'clock at night, and Delia waved it down with her whole arm, ignoring the cold that slipped through every thin thread of her clothes. She helped the old woman into the back seat, as carefully as if she were lifting something that might shatter if touched too hard. The driver glanced through the rearview mirror at the trembling figure of the woman and the waitress still wearing a grease-stained apron, then asked nothing more. Delia gave the woman a second mint, her voice softening as though she were comforting a child. "Ma'am, where do you live so I can take you home?" The old woman's breathing slowed, each breath no longer quite so rushed, and she gave Delia an address in the elegant northern part of the city, a place Delia had never once set foot in her entire life. For a moment, she faltered. That route went in the complete opposite direction from the daycare, where her little girl was waiting. But she only nodded to the driver and spoke the address clearly, without letting even the smallest trace of hesitation show. All along the way, the old woman held tightly to her hand, her palm icy cold and fragile. "You're so kind," the woman whispered, her voice still broken in places. "You didn't have to do this." Delia smiled and shook her head. "I know, ma'am, but I wanted to. You needed someone to help, and I was here. That's enough." When the taxi stopped in front of a house with a gray stone facade, the old woman shakily opened the small purse inside her coat pocket. She pulled out a stack of money, more than everything Delia earned in an entire month of bending her back, carrying plates, and pressed it into her hand. "Take it, child, as my way of saying thank you. I can see how hard your life is. You deserve it." Delia looked at the money, then at the face of the strange woman before her. She thought of the few loose bills left in her apron pocket after paying for the taxi, of her daughter's medicine bottle almost empty, of the electric bill taped to the refrigerator door that she still forced herself not to look at every morning. For one very brief moment, she knew exactly what that money could change for her and her child. Then, she gently folded the bills, placed them back into the woman's palm, and closed the woman's thin, bony fingers around them. "Ma'am, I didn't help you for this." Her voice was calm, but firm. "If I take the money, then what I did tonight wouldn't mean the same thing anymore. Please keep it, and buy medicine. Buy something warm." Knowing you got home safely is enough to make me happy." The old woman froze. In those eyes marked deeply by time, something seemed to break open. An emotion so powerful she couldn't find a name for it. She had lived 71 years in this world, had met every kind of person, and had grown used to the idea that kindness always came with some kind of price. And yet the young woman sitting before her, someone who was clearly lacking almost everything, had refused the very thing the old woman thought anyone would have grabbed without hesitation. "What is your name?" the woman asked, her voice tightening with emotion. "Just let me know your name." But at that very moment, Delia glanced at the old phone in her pocket and saw the time jump forward, making her heart clench. She was already far too late to pick up her daughter. She hurriedly opened the taxi door, helped the old woman up to the first step of the porch, made sure she could stand steadily, and only then let go of her hand. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I have to go. My daughter is waiting. Please remember to take your medicine regularly." She spoke quickly now, her voice edged with panic. Then she turned and ran back toward the taxi, leaving behind the woman who still stood motionless on the porch steps, gripping the rejected stack of money in her hand and holding on to a name she hadn't managed to hear in full. All the woman could do was watch that small figure fade into the freezing night, while one question rose inside her heart and would cling to her for many days afterward. Who was that girl? It was nearly midnight when Delia stepped out of the second taxi, in front of the private daycare that stayed open late, where kind Mrs. Hendricks had lingered to watch Posy for her at the price of a few dollars an hour. The little girl was curled up on an old couch, clutching her worn stuffed rabbit, and the moment she saw her mother's shadow, she sprang up and rushed toward her on her small, stumbling feet. "Mommy, I waited for you forever and ever," she cried, throwing her arms tightly around Delia's neck. Delia lifted her into her arms, pressed her cheek against the soft, child-scented hair, and in that moment, all the exhaustion from 9 hours of standing and carrying plates, all her worries over the stack of money she had just refused, seemed to melt away. She apologized to Mrs. Hendricks, with all the guilt in her heart, pressed the last few coins left in her apron pocket into the woman's hand, then led her daughter out to the night bus stop. The apartment where mother and child lived sat on the ground floor of an old building in the south side, where damp stains spread across the ceiling like gray clouds that never broke apart. And whenever the weather turned cold, the heating pipes groaned with tired, creaking sounds. Delia pushed against the door, which would only open when she shoved it with her shoulder, turned on the single, weak yellow light in the room, and set the little girl down on the small bed tucked against the corner wall. She knew her daughter was long past bedtime, but she still sat down on the edge of the bed and told her the story of the brave little rabbit that Posy asked to hear every night, changing her voice high and low for each character, until the child's giggles slowly softened into steady breathing. But that night, the breathing did not stay steady for long. Sometime after midnight, Delia jolted awake to a sound she knew so well it seemed carved into her very bones, the wheezing rasp that rose from Posy's small chest, each breath sounding as if it had to drag itself through a narrow crack. She sat up in an instant, and without turning on the light, she already knew what to do, her hands remembering every motion by heart. She took the nebulizer from the top of the cabinet, the most expensive thing in the entire apartment, fitted the medicine tube into place, and pressed the small mask over her daughter's face with all the tenderness she had. "Breathe in deeply for me, my princess," she whispered, her voice so calm no one could have guessed how hard her heart was pounding. The drowsy little girl obeyed, and the steady hum of the machine filled the small room, while the pale white mist of medicine helped that tiny chest slowly loosen, the wheezing growing thinner and thinner until it finally disappeared. Delia sat there, one hand stroking her daughter's hair, her eyes fixed on the bottle of medicine that was already more than half gone, when the price of a new one was nearly equal to a whole week of her tips. In her mind, the familiar numbers began dancing again without mercy. Medicine money, rent money, the electric bill soon coming due, daycare money, and the meager income that could never stretch far enough to cover it all. She thought of the thick stack of cash the strange old woman had tried to push into her hand that evening, and in one weak second, she wondered whether she had been foolish. But then she looked down at her daughter's sleeping face, peaceful and free of pain, and she knew she had done the right thing. She didn't want her child to grow up into someone who was only kind when kindness brought a reward, and the only way she could teach her daughter that was through the way she lived. She pulled the thin blanket up over the child, placed a kiss on her forehead, then leaned her back against the wall and let sleepiness come for her. Tomorrow, she would have to wake again before the first light of dawn. Another endless shift would be waiting. Along with the diner and the people she didn't yet know, would soon push her life toward the edge of a deep abyss. But tonight, inside that cramped, damp room, there was only the warmth of a sleeping child and a mother who had never once surrendered to fate. That same night, in an entirely different part of Chicago, where the city lights stretched out below like a carpet of stars, a man stood silently beside the glass window on the highest floor of a building, bearing the Vance name. Caleb Vance was 34 years old, and when he turned around, the entire room seemed to fall silent with him. Sitting across from him, in the leather chair at the center of the empty conference room, was a man named Russo, someone who had worked under him for 6 years and was now breaking out in a cold sweat despite the air conditioning being set to a cool temperature. Caleb didn't shout, didn't slam his hand on the table, didn't do any of the things people like to imagine powerful men in the shadows would do. He only pulled out a chair and sat down, placed a thin file on the tabletop, and pushed it toward Russo with 2 fingers. "I'm giving you one chance to say it yourself," he said, his voice low and even, cold as the surface of a lake frozen over in the heart of winter. Russo glanced at the file, and when he realized what was inside, his face visibly drained of color. It was evidence showing that he had secretly leaked information about Caleb's business operations to an outside force, that he had taken money to open the way for someone else to slip into territory. The Vance family had spent 2 generations building. Russo stammered, opening his mouth as if to explain himself, but Caleb only lifted one hand slightly, and silence dropped over them at once like a wall. "I don't need to hear lies," he said, "because every number in this file has already spoken for you. 6 years ago, I took you in when no one else would. I paid you more than you deserved, and I treated you like family. In return, you sold me out to someone who wants to swallow everything I have." Russo trembled as he said he had no other choice, that the other side had forced him, had threatened him. Caleb looked at him for a long while, and there wasn't a single spark of anger in his eyes, which was exactly why that absolute calm frightened Russo more than any rage ever could. "Everyone has a choice," Caleb said quietly. "You just chose wrong." Then he stood, buttoned his suit jacket with unhurried ease, and told Russo, in a voice still gentle enough to chill the blood, that from this moment on, he no longer had a place anywhere in the city where the Vance family still set foot, that every door he had once known would slam shut, and that he should be grateful the price he had to pay ended there. Russo left the building empty-handed, with nothing left but the clothes on his back, and no one in their world dared let his name pass their lips again. When the elevator doors closed behind the traitor, Caleb turned toward his most trusted associate, a quiet man named Bishop who had followed him for many years, and asked in a voice that had hardened, "So now it's clear. Someone is trying to move into our territory." Bishop nodded and replied that the signs had been appearing for a few months now. Strange streams of money flowing into their establishments, people on the payroll suddenly changing loyalties, quiet probes being made across every district. Caleb looked out through the window, where the city still glittered below in careless beauty, and something cold began to kindle in his eyes. He didn't know who was behind it yet. Not yet. But he would find out. People feared Caleb Vance, not because he was recklessly cruel, but because he never forgot and never missed a thing. In the world he lived in, loyalty was the only currency with any value, and betrayal always had to be paid for at the highest price. What neither Caleb nor the person casting a net in the darkness had any way of knowing was that their fates would soon revolve around a poor waitress on the far side of the city, the woman who only a few hours earlier had saved the life of the most important woman in Caleb Vance's world. The next morning, Caleb drove himself to the gray stone-fronted house in the northern neighborhood, the house he had bought for his mother many years earlier and still visited regularly every week, no matter how crowded his schedule became. He found Margaret sitting at the kitchen table, her hand still trembling slightly as she lifted her teacup, and the moment she saw her son walk in, she hurried to tell him about the night before, her voice full of emotion. She told him about the heart attack that had struck her in the middle of the street, about how she had fallen in front of the pharmacy, about the cold stream of people who had walked past her as though she didn't exist. Caleb stood frozen in the middle of the kitchen, his fingers tightening into fists as he listened to his mother describe how she had knelt on the icy sidewalk, how desperate she had been when not a single person would stop. But then her voice softened, and her eyes brightened, when she told him about a young woman who had crossed the street and run to her side, who had helped her up, placed a mint in her hand, and soothed her as gently as one might soothe a child. She even used her own money to call a cab and take me all the way home, Margaret said, even though I could tell just by looking at her that she didn't have much to spare. I tried to give her money to thank her, but she absolutely wouldn't take it, son. She said that if she accepted the money, then what she'd done wouldn't mean anything anymore. I've lived this long, and I've never met anyone like her. Caleb went still. In that moment, a door in his memory swung open, carrying him back to years he thought he had buried long ago. He remembered the cramped apartment of his childhood, where his mother had raised him alone after his father left, working herself down to the bone at 2 or 3 places at once, just to put food on the table. He remembered the scornful looks people gave mother and son when they counted out every small coin at the checkout counter, remembered the neighbors' whispers. He remembered the times his mother bowed her head and accepted pity mixed with contempt, without ever uttering a complaint. Most clearly of all, he remembered the night his mother collapsed from exhaustion right in front of their door, and not a single person stopped to help. Just like last night, except back then, no kind-hearted girl had appeared. It was from those years that Caleb had sworn to himself he would never let his mother bow her head before anyone ever again, and that he would make this entire city show respect when it heard their name. He had kept that oath at any cost, even costs not everyone would dare to pay. And that was also why, inside the heart people thought had turned to stone, one thing still remained untouched: a fierce hatred for those who used strength to crush the weak, for those who trampled the helpless. He came back to the present, placed his hand on his mother's shoulder, and asked in a voice that had softened completely, "What was her name, Mom? Do you know?" Margaret shook her head regretfully and said the young woman had been in a hurry to pick up her child, so she hadn't had time to give her full name. She had only vaguely heard the name Delia before the girl disappeared into the night. Delia, Caleb repeated quietly, as though carving the name into his memory. He looked at his elderly mother sitting safely before him, the woman he might have lost by now if not for that stranger, and silently promised himself that he would find the person who had saved his mother and repay her properly. He couldn't yet imagine that this search would lead him into a story far darker than anything he expected, or that the simple name Delia would soon become bound to the very war he was already facing in the shadows. The diner where Delia worked sat on a busy corner near downtown, a middle-tier restaurant that was always crowded, and the man who held life and death power there was a manager named Royce Tanner. Royce was 40 years old, with the kind of crooked half-smile that made people feel cold the moment they saw it, and he ruled the night shift staff with a petty but cruel kind of power. Every evening, when the waitstaff turned in their tips to be divided according to the restaurant's rules, Royce was always the one who counted the money, and not one of them dared say a word about the fact that the final amount they received was always far less than what they should have gotten. He had 100 ways to explain it: deductions for broken dishes, penalties for being a few minutes late, money withheld for what he called the shared fund, though no one had ever seen what that fund actually looked like. Delia understood that scam better than anyone, because she had stood in that restaurant for more than 2 years and had watched more coworkers than she could count quietly leave because they couldn't bear it anymore. But she was different from them in one way: she had nowhere else to go. For a single mother raising a sick child, even an exploited job was still better than having nothing, and Royce knew that all too well. He could smell her weakness the way an animal smells blood. That evening, after the crowd had thinned, Delia saw Royce corner a young new waitress named Megan in the kitchen and berate her loudly just because a customer had complained that the soup was cold, even though the mistake clearly belonged to the kitchen and not to the person carrying the food. Megan was only 19, her eyes wet with tears, and Royce said coldly that if she couldn't do the job, there were 100 girls outside lined up and waiting to take her place. Delia stepped forward and gently spoke up for the girl, saying that the soup had already been prepared in the kitchen beforehand, that it wasn't Megan's fault. Royce whipped around toward her, his narrowed eyes full of threat, and asked whether she was trying to teach him how to manage his staff. Delia lowered her eyes, swallowed the tightness in her throat, and said softly that she hadn't meant anything by it. She knew very well that if she pushed the matter any further, she would be the one losing her job, and she couldn't let that happen when Posey's medicine bottle was running low and the electric bill was still taped silently to the refrigerator door at home. That restraint wasn't cowardice. It was the armor poor people are forced to wear in order to survive, and every time she bowed her head like that, some quiet part of her bled inside. Royce gave a contemptuous snort and walked away, leaving Delia standing there as she steadied the still trembling Megan and patted her shoulder gently. comforting her by saying that everything would be all right, that if she just tried to do her part well, it would pass. Megan looked up at her with grateful eyes and asked why Delia was always so kind to everyone when she herself was suffering too. Delia only smiled wearily and answered that the harder people had it, the more they needed to treat one another with kindness, because if everyone turned their backs, then what would be left of this world? She didn't know that those simple words, along with the heart she had always given to the people around her, would be the very thing that saved her in the dark days ahead. Nor did she know that the man who had just turned his back and walked away was already nursing schemes far more terrible than skimming a few dollars from the tip money. That night, Delia returned home with aching legs and an almost weightless apron pocket. But she still stopped by the pharmacy and managed to buy a new bottle of medicine for her child, even if that meant her own dinner would once again be nothing more than a piece of leftover bread brought home from the diner. A few nights later, during a late shift when the diner had already closed and most of the staff had gone home, Delia stayed behind to wipe down the last section of tables before leaving to pick up her daughter. She was straightening a stack of napkins in the small storage room beside Royce's private office when she heard the office door close and the voices of two men drifting out. Normally, she wouldn't have paid any attention, but something in their tone made her freeze, a tense caution unlike any ordinary conversation. Through the narrow crack of the storage room door, Delia caught a glimpse of Royce standing across from a strange man she had never seen in the diner before. A well-dressed man in an expensive coat, carrying himself with a kind of power that made even Royce, arrogant as he was, seem servile. The stranger drew a thick envelope from inside his coat and placed it on the desk, pushing it toward Royce, then said something in a low voice, from which Delia could only catch a few scattered words. She heard him mention the name Vance. She heard phrases like, "the right moment," "make it clean," and "leave no trace." Royce picked up the envelope, quickly shoved it into a drawer, and nodded again and again, with a submissiveness Delia had never seen in him. She didn't fully understand what she had just witnessed, but the instinct of someone far too familiar with danger warned her that this was something wrong, that she had just seen something she was never meant to see. Her heart began to beat faster, and she tried to shrink quietly into the corner of the storage room, praying the two men would leave soon. But at that very moment, a stack of plastic trays she accidentally brushed against slid slightly and made a small sound in the stillness. The conversation on the other side stopped at once. Delia held her breath, pressing her back against the shelf, clearly hearing Royce's footsteps coming toward the storage room door. The door swung open, and the hallway light spilled in, exposing her completely among the half-folded napkins. Royce stared at her, a flicker of something both suspicious and cold passing through his eyes, then asked in a voice that sounded calm, but carried a buried threat, what she was still doing there at that hour. Delia tried to keep her voice from trembling, and answered that she was only finishing with the napkins before going to pick up her child. Royce looked at her for a long while, his gaze seeming to bore through her, as if trying to find out how much she had heard. Then he curled his mouth into that familiar crooked half-smile and told her to go home, that it was late. Delia quickly nodded, grabbed her purse, and left the diner with steps faster than usual, and all the way to the bus stop she couldn't shake off the unease clinging to her. She told herself that perhaps she had been overthinking it. Perhaps it was only some business matter of Royce's that had nothing to do with her, and she tried to push it out of her mind so she could focus on the everyday worries waiting for her. But behind her, inside the closed private office, Royce stood motionless, watching her shadow disappear, while a dark thought slowly began taking shape in his mind. He couldn't be sure how much that waitress had heard, but in the world he had just stepped into, no one accepted risks, not even the smallest ones. The strange man stepped out of the room, placed a hand on Royce's shoulder, and asked quietly whether that girl was going to be a problem. Royce was silent for a moment, then answered in an icy voice that he would handle it, that there would be nothing for anyone to worry about. And in that very moment, the fate of Delia Foster, a poor mother who had never harmed anyone, was decided without her knowing it. The opportunity Royce had been waiting for came on a weekend evening when the diner was packed with customers. A well-dressed guest with the bearing of someone from the upper class ate in the section of tables Delia was responsible for, and when he left, he forgot an expensive watch on the chair, a watch he had taken off while washing his hands and failed to put back on. But this was not an accident, because everything had been arranged in advance down to the smallest detail. That guest was, in truth, someone planted there by the person behind the scheme, and the watch was only the first piece in a game that had been carefully calculated. As soon as the diner thinned out, Royce quietly picked up the watch, and instead of putting it in the lost and found area according to the rules, he carried it to the staff lockers behind the kitchen. He opened Delia's locker with the spare key his position as manager allowed him to keep, and tucked the watch deep into the corner, hidden beneath her old coat and her rain shoes. Every movement he made was swift and cold, as if he had rehearsed it in his mind 100 times. Once it was done, he called a busboy named Travis, a man who owed him a favor and was willing to do anything to keep his job, and instructed him that when asked, he should say he had seen Delia lingering around the guest's table after the man left, and that he had seen her hide something on herself. The next morning, the guest returned to the diner and made a scene about the missing watch, and Royce immediately put on an eager display, declaring that he would have every employee locker checked to prove the diner's transparency. When Delia's locker was opened in front of everyone, the watch appeared beneath the coat, and the entire room fell silent for a moment, before stunned and then suspicious eyes all turned toward her. Delia went dead still. She stared at the watch in her locker, and couldn't understand why it was there. Her mouth stumbling over denials that even she could hear sounded weak. "I didn't take it. I swear I've never seen this watch before," she said, her voice breaking with panic. But not a single person in that room was looking at her the way they had before. Travis stepped forward, his head lowered, not daring to look her in the eye, and mumbled that he had seen her hovering around the guest's table the night before, and every word he spoke cut into Delia's heart like a knife. Royce stood there with his arms crossed, his face wearing a perfectly staged look of false disappointment, and announced that he had no choice but to call the police, because this was the theft of valuable property. Delia turned toward him, her eyes pleading, begging him to believe her, to give her a chance to explain, but all she received in return was a cold look, with a trace of triumph hidden beneath it, something only she could recognize. In that terrifying moment, a shard of memory flashed through Delia's mind. The image of the night she had accidentally seen Royce receive the envelope from the strange man, and a freezing fear ran down her spine as she began dimly connecting the events together. But she had no evidence, no witness, no voice in that room standing on her side. She was only a poor waitress caught with the stolen item sitting right there in her own locker, and in everyone's eyes, the truth was already painfully clear. When the sound of police sirens rose outside the diner door, Delia stood there with trembling legs, and the only thought cutting through her mind in the middle of that nightmare was not about herself, but about Posey, about her little girl waiting for her at home, about who would care for her child if her mother was dragged into the law over a crime she had never committed. 2 police officers walked into the diner, and everything after that unfolded like a nightmare from which Delia couldn't wake. They asked her a few questions, wrote down Royce's statement and Travis's statement, examined the watch taken from her locker, and then, in a dry professional voice, informed her that she needed to come with them to the station so the matter could be clarified. Delia heard those words and felt as if they were echoing toward her from some faraway place. Her ears rang, and her legs went so weak that she had to grip the edge of a table just to stay on her feet. She tried to speak, tried to explain once more that she was innocent, that something terribly wrong was happening, but her voice slipped away, and even her most honest words became meaningless against the evidence standing against her. When she was led out of the diner beneath the prying eyes of a few curious customers who had lingered behind, Delia felt as though the whole world were collapsing around her, and what hurt her most was not the humiliation of being suspected, but the complete helplessness before something she couldn't understand. At the police station, she sat alone in a small room with bare walls, both hands clasped tightly together on the cold tabletop. And for the first time in many years, she felt small and utterly alone. She had no money to hire a lawyer, no one to call for help, no powerful connection to lean on. A female officer asked whether she wanted to call anyone, and Delia sat there for a long while before realizing that in this world, she had no one to call except the one person who must never know her mother was in a place like this. She shook her head and bit her lip hard so she wouldn't cry in front of a stranger. The questions went on like that, over and over, and each time she insisted she hadn't taken the watch, the eyes of the people across from her grew even more doubtful, because to them, a poor waitress with an expensive stolen item found in her locker was a story far too familiar and far too easy to believe. They kept her there to complete the procedures and open a file, and although in the end she was released while they waited for further investigation, the shadow of a criminal case had fallen over her life like a sentence not yet spoken. When Delia stepped out of the police station late that night, she held in her hand a notice about the next legal procedures. A paper she read again and again but still couldn't fully understand, and there wasn't a single dollar left in her pocket to catch a ride home. She walked a long distance through the bone-deep cold, her mind spinning with the consequences rushing toward her. The next morning, when she called the diner with the fragile hope of being allowed to explain, the person who answered wasn't Royce but an office employee, someone who coldly informed her that she had officially been dismissed from the moment the incident took place, that the diner couldn't keep an employee involved in a theft accusation, and that she didn't need to come back. The call ended in less than 1 minute, clean and final, cutting off her only source of survival as neatly as someone cutting a thread. Delia sank down onto the chair in the small kitchen, still holding the phone in her hand, and stared blankly into the empty space before her. For more than 2 years, she had bowed her head and endured at that diner, had suffered every kind of unfairness just to keep that job, and now, in a single night, everything had dissolved into smoke. Worse than that, she wasn't leaving with only empty hands, but with a stain clinging tightly to her name. She thought of the bills soon coming due, of next month's rent, of the raw truth that she had just lost, the only thing keeping her and her child standing in this life. And for the first time, the woman who had never allowed herself to collapse felt the ground beneath her feet beginning to split open. 3 days later, while Delia was still struggling to find a way through the crisis, a knock at the door one afternoon made her heart tighten by reflex. Standing outside was a neatly dressed, middle-aged woman holding a file folder, who introduced herself as a worker from the city's child welfare agency. She said the agency had received information about Delia's legal situation, and according to procedure, they needed to come in person to assess whether the current living environment was safe and suitable for a child. Delia stood frozen on the threshold, feeling as though an icy hand had just closed around her heart and squeezed. She invited the woman inside with trembling hands that she tried to hide behind her back, and throughout the time that followed, she forced herself to answer each question in the calmest voice she could manage, even though inside she was breaking apart piece by piece. The worker looked around the cramped apartment, writing down the damp stains on the ceiling, the small bed pushed close to the corner wall, the meager kitchen, and each time the tip of her pen moved across the page, Delia felt as though something was slowly being taken from her hands. The woman asked about income, about work, and when Delia was forced to admit that she had just lost her job, a look of pity mixed with professional concern flickered across the woman's eyes. She said, in a voice that held no malice yet still chilled Delia to the bone, that a mother facing a criminal accusation and without a stable source of income was something the agency had to pay special attention to, that they weren't concluding anything yet, but a file would be opened for monitoring, and that in cases like this, if the situation didn't improve, then the child being cared for in a more appropriate environment might have to be considered. Those words, though spoken with restraint, rang in Delia's ears like a sentence being handed down. Losing her child. The 2 words she had never dared to think about now hung above her head like a sword suspended by a fragile thread. She clenched both hands, trying to keep her voice from breaking, and told the woman that Posey was everything she had, that she could endure anything in this world but absolutely couldn't lose her child, that she would do everything to prove she was a good mother. The worker nodded, wrote down a few more lines, then left behind a business card and advised her to find work soon and resolve her legal issue properly. When the door closed behind the woman, Delia leaned back against the wall and slowly slid down to the floor, her whole body shaking with the fear she had been holding in all afternoon. This fear was different from worrying about money or work. This was a fear that touched the most sacred thing in her life, the blood-bound cord between her and her little girl. But she didn't allow herself to collapse for long, because only a few minutes later she had to pick up Posey, and she knew that even if the sky fell, her daughter must never be allowed to feel even a trace of the terror gnawing at her mother. She went into the bathroom, washed her face with cold water, drew in a deep breath, and stared into the mirror until her face recovered its familiar calm. And when she picked up her daughter from Mrs. Hendricks, no one could have guessed what the gentle, smiling mother had just endured. She still told Posey the story of the brave little rabbit, still cooked her a simple dinner from the few things left in the cabinet, still giggled with her when the little girl showed off a crooked drawing of mother and daughter holding hands beneath a lopsided sun. Posey knew nothing at all about the fact that her mother's world was on the verge of shattering, and Delia vowed to use the last bit of strength she had to keep her child's world whole and warm, even if the price was that she had to carry all the pain alone in silence. Disaster always chooses the moment when people are weakest to come crashing down. And for Delia, the heaviest blow arrived one night only a few days later. Posey's nebulizer medicine had run out the day before, and with her pockets empty and her job gone, Delia was still struggling to scrape together enough money to buy a new bottle, comforting herself with the thought that in just 1 or 2 more days, she would find a way. But her daughter's asthma did not wait for her arrangements. In the middle of the night, Posey's breathing became more strained than it had ever been, and this time, there was no medicine, no familiar white mist to soothe that tiny chest. Delia woke with a start, and in a single instant she understood that this was not an ordinary asthma attack, not one she could still manage at home by herself. She didn't hesitate for even a second. She gathered her child tightly into her arms, wrapped her in a blanket, and rushed out of the apartment to call an ambulance, her voice so urgent it nearly broke. All the way to the hospital, she held her daughter close, pressed her forehead against the child's forehead, and kept whispering gentle words of reassurance. "Mommy is here now. You're going to be all right. I promise you," even while her own heart was screaming in absolute terror. When they reached the hospital, the doctors and nurses immediately took Posey from her arms and carried the little girl into the pediatric emergency unit with all the urgency and professionalism they had, while Delia was kept outside the door as the medical team began caring for her child. In that very moment, the moment she was forced to let go and watch her little girl disappear behind that door, the mother's heart inside her felt as though it had been torn in two. She stood there with both hands pressed against the glass, following her child's shadow with her eyes until she could no longer see it, and for the first time after so many days of forcing herself to endure, she couldn't hold herself together anymore. She sank onto a chair in the hospital hallway, her shoulders shaking, and she cried. She cried silently, yet with a grief that seemed to break her apart, the long-suppressed tears of a mother who had not allowed herself to be weak for far too long. She cried not only because of her daughter's illness, but because of everything, because of the injustice that had pushed her to this point, because of the guilt that tormented her when she thought that if only she'd had the money to buy the medicine in time, her little girl wouldn't have had to lie inside that room, because of the helplessness of a mother who loved her child more than her own life, and still could not protect her completely. She blamed herself, wondering whether she was a failed mother, whether the words of the child welfare worker might actually be true, whether perhaps her daughter would be better off somewhere else, in the arms of someone who had the means to care for her better than Delia could. But then she immediately pushed that thought away, because no one in this world loved Posey the way she did, and she would rather die than ever let go of her child. Time in that quiet hospital hallway seemed to stretch as long as an entire lifetime, every passing minute a kind of torture, until at last, a female doctor stepped out, her face carrying a reassuring smile that made Delia's whole chest feel as if a great stone had been lifted from it. The doctor said the little girl was out of danger, that they had gotten the situation under control, and Posey was breathing easily again, that she only needed to rest and be watched for a little while longer before she would be all right. Delia sprang to her feet, took the doctor's hand, and stammered words of thanks that could barely form into sentences, tears spilling down again, though this time they were tears of relief. When she was allowed to see her daughter, Posey was lying quietly on the hospital bed, color already returning to her face, and the little girl smiled faintly as she called for her mother in a voice that was still a little weak. Delia bent down and held her as gently as she could, pressed her lips to her daughter's hair, and in that rare, peaceful moment, she told herself that as long as her little girl was still here, still smiling at her, then she would still have the strength to fight, even if she had to face the entire world. Over the past few days, Caleb Vance had never stopped searching for the young woman who had saved his mother. With his network of connections spread across the city, he only needed to follow a few small clues: the name Delia, a diner near downtown, a waitress with a young child, and that was enough for his people to build a portrait of the woman. But what the report placed on his desk contained not only gratitude, but also a story that made his eyes darken. He read about how she had been accused of theft, about how she had been detained and then lost her job, about a child who had just been hospitalized. Something in the whole story did not fit. A coincidence far too neat that made the instincts of an experienced man like him sharpen with warning. But above all, the thing that made him immediately rise and put on his coat was the image of the woman who had saved his mother without weighing gain or loss, now collapsing in the middle of her own calamity. He went to the hospital one evening, and he recognized her at once from his mother's description. The young woman with a face worn thin by sleeplessness, sitting quietly beside her little daughter's bed. Delia looked up when she saw a strange man in a dark suit walk in, and by instinct, she straightened slightly, a trace of caution crossing her eyes, the look of someone far too used to disaster arriving from unexpected places. Caleb stopped at a respectful distance, his voice low and steady, as he introduced himself as the son of the elderly woman she had helped on that cold, rainy night in front of the pharmacy not long ago. It took Delia a moment to understand, and when she remembered the poor old woman's face from that night, the guarded look on her own face softened a little. He said his mother had never forgotten her, that she still spoke of Delia every day as if speaking of an angel, and that he himself had been searching for her all this time just to say the thank you he owed her. Delia gently shook her head and answered that she had only done what anyone should have done, that she didn't need to be thanked, and that simple answer made Caleb fall silent for a moment. He looked at the woman before him, at the way she sat protectively beside her child even while she herself was exhausted, at the resilience shining through her tired eyes, and in that moment he saw the shadow of his own mother from years ago, the woman who had carried an entire world alone on her thin shoulders, without once complaining, the same quiet pride, the same heart that refused to surrender to hardship. He asked softly about the child, and Delia answered that the little girl was out of danger, her voice still carrying a faint tremor that hadn't yet faded. Then, as if she couldn't hold it back, perhaps because it had been too long since anyone had listened to her without judgment in their eyes, Delia quietly confessed that she was going through the worst days of her life, that she had been accused of a crime she did not commit and had no way to prove her innocence. She did not pour out her pain to beg for help. She only spoke as if setting down part of a burden, then immediately apologized for troubling him with her own problems. But Caleb was not troubled at all. He listened to every word she said, and behind his familiar, calm exterior, the pieces in his mind had begun to fit together in silence. The name of a diner, an accusation too perfect, and the hazy shadow of the enemy he had been hunting. He stood, leaving her with words whose calm tone could not hide their weight, telling her to stay strong and take care of her daughter, that sometimes justice came late, but it still came, and that she was not as alone as she believed. Delia could not yet understand the full meaning of those words, but as she watched the strange man's figure disappear beyond the door, for the first time in many days, she felt something faintly flicker inside her chest, something she thought she had lost, and it was hope. After Posey had been discharged from the hospital and had recovered, and after she had been left in the care of kind Mrs. Hendricks, Delia decided she would not sit still and wait for fate to crush her. The meeting with the strange man at the hospital had rekindled something inside her, not exactly the hope of being rescued, but a reminder that she could still fight for herself. She began tracing back every fragment of memory from that fateful night, and the more she thought about it, the more certain she became that the watch appearing in her locker had not been an accident, but something arranged by Royce's hand. She remembered the night she had accidentally seen him receive the envelope from the strange man, remembered the cold look in his eyes when he caught her in the storage room, and she understood that she had become a thorn that needed to be pulled out. But instinct alone was not enough. She needed evidence. Delia remembered that behind the diner, near the row of employee lockers, there was an old security camera that few people paid attention to. If that camera had recorded Royce opening her locker on the night the watch was planted, then it would be the one thing that could clear her name. With the little courage she still had left, she went to Megan, the young waitress she had once defended, the only person at the diner who still dared stand on her side. After a moment of hesitation born from fear, Megan agreed to help her, telling Delia that the recordings were usually saved on the computer in the manager's office, and that she might be able to find a way to access it when Royce was away. But just as Megan was about to act, Royce seemed to smell that something was wrong. One afternoon, while Delia was lingering near the diner waiting for news from Megan, Royce stopped her right on the sidewalk. He didn't shout. He only looked at her with threatening eyes and released warnings as cold as ice, saying she should know better and worry about herself, that a woman already caught in legal trouble and on the verge of losing her child shouldn't invite more trouble, that there were forces behind this matter far greater than anything she could imagine, and that if she was smart, she would keep her mouth shut and disappear. Instead of making Delia back down, the threat confirmed for her that she was moving in the right direction, that there truly was a conspiracy behind everything that had happened to her. But it also made her realize a bitter truth. She was standing against something far too large for an unarmed single mother to face alone. Even if she got the footage, With someone like Royce protected by power and money, who would believe the words of a poor waitress already branded as a thief? Who would be strong enough to force him and the people behind him to answer for what they had done? She might be able to find one missing piece, but she did not have enough power to fit the whole picture together and place it on the table of justice. That evening, Delia returned home torn between determination and despair, and as she sat beside her sleeping daughter's bed, she thought of the man at the hospital, of his words that she was not as alone as she believed. At the time, she had not fully understood what those words meant, but now, at her most helpless point, she found herself clinging to them like a faint light at the end of a tunnel. She did not know that while she was struggling alone in the darkness, in another part of the city, that man had already begun silently pulling each thread of the net he had cast, and the people who had pushed her into the abyss were about to face a force they had never seen coming. While Delia struggled alone in the middle of a dead end, on the highest floor of the Vance building, Caleb had quietly stepped into the matter with all the coldness and precision of a man accustomed to controlling great games of strategy. He assigned Bishop the task of digging deep into the diner where Delia had once worked, and what his most trusted associate brought back made him sit in silence for a long time at his desk. As it turned out, that diner belonged to a chain of businesses that had recently been repeatedly targeted for takeover by an outside force, and the manager, Royce Tanner, was one of the links the other side had bought off to act as an inside man, sabotaging from within and clearing the way for the seizure. When Bishop traced the money flowing into Royce's pocket, every thread eventually led back to a name Caleb knew all too well: Lawrence Kessler, a rising figure in the underground business world, an ambitious old fox who had been quietly dreaming of swallowing the territory the Vance family had spent 2 generations building. Kessler was the one behind Russo, the traitor Caleb had purged that night, and now he was continuing to plant people throughout Caleb's businesses, patiently weaving a delicate web of destruction. But what made the cold anger inside Caleb rise to its peak was the moment he fitted the final piece of the picture into place. His people confirmed that during the exact period when Delia was being framed, a secret meeting had taken place between Royce and one of Kessler's men right inside the diner, and that the unfortunate waitress had accidentally been nearby. Caleb understood everything. Delia was not the victim of an ordinary theft case. She had been targeted because she had accidentally seen something she was never meant to see, and that perfect trap had been set not only to silence her, but also to turn her into a pawn, to be sacrificed. A clean little incident that allowed them to remove a risk while hiding their own movements. The woman who had saved his mother, the most honest woman he had ever met, had been crushed simply because she was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and she had been thrown into the mud by his own enemies. To Caleb, the matter had now gone far beyond the debt of gratitude he wanted to repay. It had become personal, a declaration of war that Kessler did not even know he had begun. He sat there in the silent room, his fingers woven together, and there was no blazing fire of rage in his eyes, only an absolute coldness, the kind of coldness that everyone who had ever faced him knew was the most dangerous sign of all. He did not rush. A man like him never struck before he held the whole game firmly in his hands. He had his people quietly gather every piece of evidence they could, from the security footage Delia herself was desperately longing to find, to recordings, suspicious financial flows, every link connecting Royce to Kessler, and connecting them both to the staged plot against Delia. He even approached Travis, the man who had lied in his statement, and with only a few words, along with the truth about how the man was being used and would later be thrown away, Caleb made him ready to turn back and testify to the truth. One by one, each piece was placed in its proper position, silently and precisely, until the net Caleb had cast was tight enough that not a single man could escape. When everything was ready, Caleb stood by the glass window and looked down at the glittering city below, then quietly ordered Bishop to arrange a meeting. It was time for those who thought they could trample the innocent without paying a price to learn a lesson, that in this city, there were lines no one was allowed to cross, and that the man who had pushed the woman who saved his mother into the abyss was about to understand what the true wrath of Caleb Vance really meant. The meeting was arranged in a large conference room, and the men summoned there arrived with entirely different states of mind. Royce walked in with the usual servile look he wore whenever he had to face someone stronger than himself, while Lawrence Kessler appeared relaxed and confident, assuming this was merely an ordinary business negotiation, even wearing the smug smile of a man certain he still held the upper hand. He had no idea that he had just walked straight into a net already drawn tight around him. Caleb sat at the head of the table, so calm it chilled the blood, and beside him were Bishop and a large screen that had been prepared in advance. He wasted no words on polite greetings. He only gave a slight nod, and the first image that appeared on the screen made the smile on Kessler's lips stiffen for an instant. It was footage from the old security camera behind the diner, clearly recording Royce secretly opening Delia's locker that night and slipping the watch inside. Every movement so obvious it couldn't be denied. Royce's face went deathly pale. He stammered, about to open his mouth and explain, but Caleb only lifted one hand slightly, and the second recording appeared. This time, it was an audio recording of the secret meeting between Royce and Kessler's subordinate, in which Royce's own voice rang out with unmistakable clarity, discussing how they needed to handle the waitress who had seen what she shouldn't have seen, turning her into a thief so they could both silence her and push her out of the game. The entire room sank into a suffocating silence as every line exposed the true faces of the men sitting there. Then Caleb presented the final piece. The money flow charts his people had traced, each payment moving from Kessler's accounts into Royce's pocket and into the hands of other inside men, drawing the full picture of a systematic takeover plot, hidden behind the cover of incidents that had seemed separate and unrelated. Kessler could no longer keep his easy composure. His face hardened, and he tried to salvage the situation with a faint sneer, saying that a few recordings and some numbers proved nothing, that Caleb had no right to judge him. But Caleb only looked at him with a calm so frightening it seemed almost inhuman, and in a steady, low voice that did not rise even once, he began laying bare each link in the chain, naming every person in Kessler's organization who had taken part, recounting every date, every meeting, every transaction, with such precision that Kessler slowly understood the man sitting across from him held far more than he had ever imagined. The peak of the reveal came when the conference room door opened, and Travis stepped inside, the false witness from back then now standing there with his head lowered in guilt, ready to tell the entire truth about how he had been pressured into inventing lies to frame Delia. His testimony, together with all the evidence already exposed, officially cleared the innocent woman completely, turning the theft charge that had seemed impossible to escape into a shameless setup stripped bare beneath the light. Royce collapsed into his chair, every trace of his usual arrogance gone, while Kessler shot to his feet, for the first time in his calculating life feeling the ground beneath him give way. Caleb remained seated at the head of the table, never once raising his voice, never making a single unnecessary movement, and it was precisely that absolute composure that terrified everyone in the room. He hadn't needed a single threat. He hadn't needed a single act of violence. He had only placed the truth on the table, piece by piece, and allowed that truth itself to crush the men who had believed they could trample an innocent person and never pay the price. And when his cold eyes swept across the two men frozen before him, everyone understood that this exposure was only the beginning. When the truth had been fully exposed, Caleb slowly rose to his feet, and that single movement alone was enough to make the entire room hold its breath. He walked around the long table, each step unhurried, and began speaking about the price the men sitting there were about to pay, not in the tone of a man seeking revenge, but with the coldness of someone reading aloud an inevitability. He told Kessler that the entire business network he had worked so hard to build was now sitting neatly in Caleb's hands, that every partner, every source of funding, every man working under him had already been identified, and that each of them would abandon him one by one the moment they learned he had lost his footing. Driven into a corner, Kessler lost the last of his composure. He lunged toward Caleb with a face twisted by rage, but Caleb didn't even need to move. Bishop and Caleb's men were there at once, subduing him quickly and decisively, pinning him down without any unnecessary brutality, and within only a few seconds, every bit of his resistance had become meaningless. Caleb lowered his gaze to him, and in a voice so quiet it could barely be heard, he said that Kessler's greatest mistake wasn't daring to covet his territory, but trampling an innocent person, an honest mother, simply to serve his own greed. He said there were lines that, once crossed, left no road back, and that Kessler had crossed one on the very day he ordered the destruction of Delia Foster's life. Kessler's fate was decided inside that very room. All evidence of his illegal operations would be delivered to exactly where it needed to go, and the underground empire he had built with schemes and cruelty would collapse into ruins, leaving him with nothing but disgrace and the sentences waiting ahead. As for Royce, Caleb reserved for him a contempt even colder, because in Caleb's eyes, a man willing to sell his conscience in order to destroy a defenseless woman and her little child was the most disgusting kind of person. He would face the law for fabricating a false accusation, and the doors to every opportunity in this city would slam shut in his face forever. But the most valuable moment did not come from Caleb. It came from someone else. He had arranged for Delia to be brought there, so she could witness justice being carried out with her own eyes, so she would know she had never been alone. When Delia stepped into the room and saw the entire truth laid bare, when she saw Royce with his head bowed in the humiliation of a defeated man, she did not cheer, nor did she release a single bitter word. She only walked forward in silence, stood before Royce, and looked at him with eyes that held not hatred, but a deep and steady calm, the eyes of someone who had passed through the very end of suffering and still refused to let her heart become darkness. She told him in a gentle but firm voice that she didn't understand how he could be so cruel to someone who had never harmed him, that he had nearly taken from her daughter the only mother she had in this world. But even so, she still did not wish for him to suffer the terrible things he had caused her, because she did not want to become someone like him. It was those words, that mercy he could never understand, that left Royce unable to lift his face. He bowed his head low, and for the first time in his life, the man who had always been used to crushing those weaker than himself felt small and utterly contemptible before the woman he had once looked down upon. Caleb stood silently watching it all, and in his usually cold eyes there rose a deep respect for the woman who had taught even the most powerful men a lesson about human dignity. In the days after the truth was exposed, Delia's life began to come back to life little by little, like cracked earth receiving the first drops of spring rain. The theft accusation was officially dismissed. Her name was cleared, and the stain that had weighed on her for so many days finally disappeared. But Caleb did not stop there. He knew that for a mother like Delia, there was no pain greater than watching her child struggle against illness, while she herself stood helpless, and so he quietly arranged for Posey to be examined and treated at one of the leading hospitals in the city, a place with the best specialists in pediatric respiratory care. For the first time in her life, the little girl had access to a proper treatment plan, instead of relying only on an old nebulizer and bottles of medicine bought drop by drop with a few meager dollars in tips. Delia broke down crying when the doctor told her that with the right care, Posey's condition could absolutely be managed, that the little girl could have a healthy childhood like any other child. And in that bright, warm hospital room, the circle of the story closed in the gentlest way. One afternoon, Margaret came to visit Posey, and when the elderly woman walked in with a kind smile, Delia was stunned to realize that the old woman she had once saved on that cold, rainy night was the mother of the man who had helped her. Margaret sat down beside the little girl's bed and spoke to her tenderly, then took a small box of mints from her coat pocket and placed it in Posey's tiny palm. She told the child that her mother, one night, had given Margaret a mint just like this when she fell ill in the street, and that the tiny mint and her mother's heart had saved her life. Posey looked up at her mother with shining eyes full of pride and said in her sweet, clumsy voice that her mommy was the best person in the world. Delia stood there with one hand covering her mouth, tears rolling down her cheeks, but this time they were tears of happiness and comfort, something she had not tasted in far too long. The moment that mint returned, completing its journey from the hand of a poor mother who had helped a stranger to the hand of her own little child, was the moment Delia understood that the kindness she had planted had never been meaningless. Later, Delia gradually learned that Caleb had quietly done far more for her than she had ever imagined. He had spoken discreetly with the Child Welfare Agency, not to use power to pressure them, but to make clear that every accusation against her had been fabricated, and that she was a devoted mother. And because of that, the monitoring file was closed, and the fear of losing her child finally faded away. He also introduced her to a decent, honest new job, a chance for her to stand firmly on her own feet, because he understood that what this proud woman needed was not charity, but a fair doorway she could walk through. But he never took credit, never mentioned what he had done, and it was that quietness that made Delia's gratitude deepen even more. She understood that what she had won back had not been something someone simply handed to her, but the result of the courage she had clung to through her darkest days, and Caleb had only reached out at the right moment to help her stand again. Between two people who seemed to belong to two separate worlds, a quiet understanding and respect began to bloom, not a loud or hurried affection, but the meeting of two souls who both understood what it meant to be strong, and what it meant to be kind. And when Delia watched her daughter laughing and playing in good health beside the gentle old woman, she knew that the freezing winter night long ago, the night she had traded 20 minutes of her life to save a stranger, had truly rewritten the entire rest of her and her child's future, exactly as fate had silently promised. Many months later, when the harsh winter had given way to warm days, Delia Foster's life had changed completely, not because she had suddenly become wealthy, or because luck had lifted her into another world, but because she had won back the most precious things of all, dignity and peace for herself and her daughter. She had an honest job in a place where people looked at her with respect. Her daughter was healthy, laughing and chattering every day, and there was no longer any fear pressing heavily on Delia's heart. Delia's story reminds us of something simple, yet profound, that the true worth of a person has never been found in the amount of money they carry in their pocket or the position they hold in society, but in the heart they offer to others, especially in moments when no one is watching, and there is nothing to receive in return. True kindness isn't something displayed in the hope of being repaid. It is what we still quietly do even when no one is looking, even when we ourselves are lacking in every possible way. Delia did not help the strange old woman because she knew the woman was the mother of a powerful man. She did it simply because another human being needed help, and that unconditional kindness came back to shelter her when she was at her most desperate. Life can sometimes be terribly harsh to good people, but this story is a warm reminder that the good seeds we plant today, no matter how small they may seem, will one day bloom and bear fruit in ways we could never have imagined, and that in a world that can sometimes feel cold and indifferent, there are still people willing to stop, bend down, and reach out a hand to one another. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video with the people you love, so that every day we can listen together to more meaningful and compelling stories. How do you feel about Delia's story, and which part moved you the most? Please leave a comment and share the feelings from deep inside your heart, because we're always eager to hear your sincere thoughts. Thank you for taking the time to watch until the very last moment. We wish everyone watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and love filling each day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next videos.